let's just jump right into the case studies. And I think we're starting with Sam. So Sam, if you don't mind, thing here, and you can just use the arrow keys. What I'll do is I'll just let you know when you can take your mask off. Yeah, I'll let you know when you've had 5 minutes, just so you know you've got another 2 minutes. Okay.
To talk that long.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm Sam Schneider, 4th-year anthropology student, doing specialization in sociocultural anthropology. So the first case study that I'm presenting is anthropology and endemic Ebola in West Africa. So this case study is interesting because it's a very direct application of anthropology with very meaningful results. So in 2014, there was a widespread Ebola outbreak in West Africa, and they were having trouble containing it with established methods. So by the end of October, there were 1,300 people infected and 5,000 people, or almost 5,000 people then. So in November, they brought in an anthropologist, a response and resilience team anthropologist. Just as a side note, people ask if there's any work with an anthropology degree. There is. That is the job. That is the one job that anthropologists can get outside of academia. So the anthropologists used quick and dirty anthropological training methods to teach people in the Oxfam team. That was the charitable organization dealing with the outbreak. And by teaching these methods, they were able to make use of the data that the teams had already found out and learned. So the Oxfam team originally thought that the barriers they were teaching were cultural. They thought that there was resistance to the Ebola prevention measures just from sort of like cultural misunderstandings, and that's where the resistance was coming from. So when they brought in the anthropologist, though, she went through and she started using the anthropological methods. She found out that no, that wasn't actually the case. So there was some cultural resistance. There were very basic systematic issues that they were dealing with. So she summed it up as a lack of staff, space, and systems. So what this means is that they were trying one-way communication. The Oxfam team was dropping off pamphlets to try and spread information. And this was not having an impact on the population. Basically, people wouldn't be reading the pamphlets and they would become distrustful. They would also be getting medicine from other teams, and they wouldn't be able to understand the information, so they wouldn't understand the side effects. So when they take medicine that would make people feel ill for a few days, they would consider it poison. So after recognizing these barriers that they were coming across, she realized that the solution was more two-way communication, working with chiefs, embedding people in the communities so that they could build trust. And by building this sort of two-way communication, they're better able to spread information and reduce the outbreaks and contain it. So that's a very direct application that had very meaningful immediate results. What's interesting too is that some of the families in Ebola, or the communities in West Africa, saw Ebola as a family disease, as they described it as a monster that would attack families. And this kind of description of disease is a common one. So in finding Ozo in healthcare, this one is about Western medicine and traditional healing methods being employed. So the Navajo people, just as an aside, Navajo is a name given by Spanish settlers. They're also called the Dime, I think is how you pronounce it. Dime? Dime. The Dime. I'm terrible at pronunciation, so that's on me. The Dime. So, but the author of the article still used the term Navajo. So that's just a term I'll be using for this. So the Navajo people like to, they believe in using traditional healing methods alongside Western medicine. So they find, though, that Western healthcare only focuses on the illness and not the person as a whole. So what this means is that when a member left the community, became a doctor, and came back and started teaching medicine, she found that the community members were dissatisfied unsatisfied with the healthcare that they're receiving. And what it ended up being is that they were not receiving the traditional healing that they needed or that they wanted. So they left unsatisfied with the healthcare system. So to deal with this, she opened up they opened up a traditional healing house next to the hospital. And this allowed them to employ traditional healing methods alongside Western medicine to better work with the community so that people could get the sort of healthcare that they wanted. And this kind of cultural healing and traditional methods is important. It helps a community of people sort of be treated as actual people and not just as statistics and numbers. So in the third case, from bean to bar, cultural esteem and healing through chocolate. Title's cut off a little bit, but that's not a problem. This one was really, really interesting for me because it comes out of Canada. And really cool. So the Vancouver's downtown east side is considered a zone of abandonment. People think it's beyond hope. There's a lot of drug use, a lot of survival sex trade there. People avoid it in general if they can. But so what happened was group of people, I can't remember that name of it, unfortunately. Their goal was to create low barrier employment with social capital. So what they did is they established a chocolatier place that would hire people who weren't able to come in regularly. They'd offer them employment, people who didn't have access to resumes or that kind of stuff, and they'd give them a job. They wouldn't just give them a job that paid them money. It wasn't, just janitor work, whatever. It was a job that had actual social capital. Because what they recognized was the importance of self-esteem, right, and dignity in these kinds of methods. So by establishing this chocolatier shop, they provide a safe place for people to work, a place where people could find employment, but they could also actually go out in the community and directly impact the community where they lived. What was interesting about it is that they had very low bar when people started working. They would allow you to come in just when you're able to work, but that would then turn into full-time employment. Yeah, so that's the quick and dirty of this one. The other thing they did, people doing this did a lot of really cool things. They were working with at-risk population, but specifically they were working with women, drug users, and they worked with the BC Housing Committee to renovate a hotel to create rooms that were for recovery. Hotel rooms create rooms for recovery. And that gave women who wanted to work a place that they could go, they could recover, they could get clean, they could have stable employment, but they could also have dignity in the jobs that would actually carry social capital. People ask what you do, well, I'm a chocolatier. Carries more weight than just being a janitor. And this provided people with a chance to sort of build a life again, to get a solid foothold to continue living their lives. And they could also give back to the community. Because of where the chocolatier shop was located, near around the downtown east side, they had a program where anyone could come in and they could get, if they couldn't afford a cup of coffee or a cup of hot chocolate, they'd be given one. And this allowed them to integrate and work with the community as well. So thank you. That's my part of the presentation.
Thank you. So next up, we've got Blair, who's going to present 3 more cases.
All right, so my first case study is the Dugwell revival in Bihar, India. So this is a flood-affected area where Dugwells used to be the main water source. They are kind of open pits so the water is very visible. You can see it right away, and They used to be collectively owned by castes, so there was a lot of caste discrimination when it came to managing the dug wells and how that water was, distributed. So that caused a route for caste-based violence. Now, hand pumps are more popular. They're owned by a single family. They're perceived to be cleaner because you can't see the water. And it used to be thought that the further you dig, the cleaner the water is. So having a hand pump is associated with status, wealth, especially because hand pumps are more complicated. They're drilled into the ground and they're not easy to maintain. You have to outsource your maintenance. You can't maintain it yourself. So that means there's external monetary exchanges that only someone with a lot of money would be able to afford. So the problem with the move from dug wells to hand pumps is that water quality actually decreased because when they drill further down into the land to install hand pumps, they actually release arsenic into the water, which actually also contaminates water deposits, which can cause dug wells in the same area to be affected. So if one person with a hand pump releases arsenic into the area, then everyone's water is affected. In addition, because dug wells used to be maintained collectively and they are on a surface level, they're a lot easier to maintain. And you don't need to outsource that maintenance. So MPA, a group of 5 non-government organizations, wanted to revive dug wells to improve people's living conditions by allowing them to maintain their water sources themselves, also, to avoid just arsenic being contaminated into the water. Our anthropologist who wrote up this case, she wanted to disrupt the typical social development intervention cycle. So usually NGOs will go in, solve a problem, give them a solution, and then leave. And then those people aren't able to then maintain that program, or people in the area become completely dependent, which really reduces the self-esteem of the community, and can impact them in many other ways. So her idea was to conduct ethnography, but instead of interviewing the community, she simply wanted to start conversations about dug wells and maintenance knowledge that was still around, but it was only around in elder communities and hadn't been passed on. So by doing this, she encouraged local knowledge transmission, so that younger generations would be able to maintain these dug wells, and revive the ones that were around but had not been maintained for a long time. The problem was they didn't want to, by reviving dug wells, they didn't want to also rejuvenate the caste discrimination that was associated with it. So a lot of dug wells were revived and successfully managed collectively by a community. Not all of them were maintained long-term. Some of them were left again, but in all cases, water quality improved every time a dug well was restored. And there was no resurgence of any caste discrimination, whether or not the maintenance project continued with a specific dug well. In addition, MPA had a hard time staying involved with the project So after a few years, the community was sort of left to their own devices, and they found that after another few years, they were still continuing to maintain their dug wells. So this showed that given the agency, and in fact, they already had the agency to solve this problem on their own, they just needed a bit of a reminder. The solution and the outcomes can be so much greater than when an NGO just comes in and does the work for a community that they could have, done themselves. So this quote just kind of sums that up, but I've already sort of summarized how she came in and disrupted that process of, intervention. My next case study, excuse me, I have some cue cards for this one because it's very complicated, but I probably won't use them because I never do. So this one has to do with a woman-led routine road maintenance project in rural Vietnam, particularly by minority ethnic women's groups. So the problem in a lot of rural mountainous regions in Vietnam is that there's not good road linkage. So this leads to high poverty rates, low education levels, poor health because they can't access healthcare. In addition, it's hard to build roads and maintain them. It's dangerous, so not a lot of outside crews want to come in and do that. It's also very expensive because it's so remote. And there's not a lot of knowledge about road maintenance in local communities, and there's almost no awareness about why it's important or how it could benefit them to maintain the roads. So the Third Rural Transport Project team was a group that started a pilot alongside the provincial Department of Transportation in Lao Cai province of Vietnam, alongside the Women's Union. So for this pilot, the provincial Department of Transportation employed, trained, and supervised women who were members of the Women's Union in the area, particularly ethnic minority women. And then after a few years, the National Ministry of Transportation wanted to expand the pilot project. Most notably, they wanted to start an awareness campaign that would increase, understanding and support of the importance of road maintenance in the community. And they also wanted to expand training to other groups in the community, not just ethnic minority women. They included men, but they wanted to involve the Women's Union more into the organization and the training, so that they would lead the training, not only be employed. So our anthropologist, Clark, her role was to refine the pilot's approach, justify its expansion, and design the expansion. So in order to refine the pilot's approach, she wanted to create better coordination amongst the different organizations working together because there were so many. She had to observe these organizations, understand their relationships using ethnography to help them to better define their roles, responsibilities, and communication with each other so that there was no conflict once the expansion project actually started. In addition, she used ethnography to understand the communication needs of the target populations, and better design training materials and awareness campaigns to cater to the different languages in the area, the different levels of education as well. She also, used ethnography again to study the Ministry of Transportation employed that knowledge to design workshops and presentations that would appeal to ministry staff and convince them to expand the project. And she also helped design a ethnographic-based evaluation of the project so that the expansion would build on what was positive about the pilot. So overall, roads improved. As a result, health improved, education, and there was a lot of economic growth because there was a culture of road stewardship in the community once everyone was able to maintain the roads and understood the importance. In addition, women's status and self-esteem, both in their home and in their communities, improved. They were able to have more of a voice in decision-making. And she helped create institutional change at the Ministry of Transportation in their awareness of gender when they are creating operations, policies, and so on. So again, this case really worked on creating agency for local groups. Here they didn't have the prerequisite knowledge required for that, so there was a more hands-on approach where they had to bring in the knowledge, but they also allowed them to become the trainers of their own community. So in this next case study, it deals again with communication a lot, but also begins to expand on the institutional problems within an organization. So the DFDS shipping company asked our anthropologist for help identifying why new technologies given to ships and their crew weren't being implemented consistently by identical ships. The company thought that it was related to possible differences in onboard management culture. So I really like this approach. They conducted field work on identical ships. It's really funny how they put quotations around it. And this quote is really great. It really shows how when an anthropologist is employed by a company, they're often asked to study other people, staff, communities unrelated to the organization, to figure out why they aren't doing something correctly, or how the problem is sourced inside that other group. So anthropologists usually are kind of sneaky and do both. They study the other group and they also study how the organization can do better. So they found that the ships were not identical, like the company thought, because the humans operating the technologies and steering the ships were not identical. The main problems were miscommunication between the shore, the company, and the ship, and how they implemented the technology. Things were not clear about how they should be used and why they need to be used in a certain way. And the company didn't consider the professional experience, the discretion, or the sense of responsibility a person feels when they are making decisions on a ship, especially regarding something as important as navigation, which is what the new technologies were dealing with. So they just decided that really the problem was with how the company itself communicated. They needed to be more careful about how they gave and presented these new technologies to their staff. All right, I will hand it off to Saoirse.
Use the arrows.
Just use the arrows, yeah.
Hi everyone, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
First case study I did is the Denver Museum of Nature and Science Repatriation Initiative. The problem here is that the Denver Museum has a big history that's like longstanding in looting and stealing. So it's not really ethically appropriate for them to have like all the artifacts they did have, especially the human remains they have, because they did not check where they came from. And then when NAGPRA came in to work, they started working with them and had tribes come to them, and they were trying to give back these remains. However, it wasn't really a good method. It put a lot of burden on tribes because they had to come out actively and like seek these remains rather than the Denver Museum coming to them. And also the Denver Museum, after like a few years, kind of just gave up and stopped doing it altogether. So they had a full staff turnover because of this, because they were not in compliance with NAGPRA. So the approach the new staff had taken was they first made a written policy where they would no longer accept any illegally acquired items or any more remains or anything that had suspicious acquirements. So it wasn't really well documented how those things came into possession, just so that they were clear on those bases. And then they reevaluated past NAGPRA claims that had been ignored in the years that they were not in compliance with, the old staff wasn't in, and went through all of them one by one and talked to all those tribes to give back remains and artifacts they had. And then they took an extra step, which is to then re-examine museum artifacts that were determined to be culturally unaffiliated, meaning no tribes had come to them and claimed that these could be theirs. And they consulted 142 tribes in a big meeting to talk about what to do with these remains, and came to the outcome agreements in writing and in practice to return 67 individual remains, which is the rest they had left over, to be reburied in 4 separate areas, which I'm pretty sure is the plains, the southeast, northwest, and I think west coast. And then as they quote, they also had the reburial of 97 sets of human remains, 317 associated funerary objects, 11 unassociated funerary objects, and the repatriation of 231 sacred objects and objects of cultural patrimony. So they took like an extra mile to really seek out these tribes and see if any things they had could be possibly theirs. And if there was a chance, they were willing to give it up, which is very good. And now they no longer curate human remains at all. So a whole like staff turnover and different museum at this point. And that's a very direct example of how an outcome can happen from an anthropological approach. The next one I have is the Alan Boraz and Katnet Anna Kanega. I probably butchered that. I'm very sorry. And the renewal of Alaska Native language, or preservation renewal. The problem here is that the prevalence of a severely endangered Kenai Alaskan dialect was impacted massively by historical processes, which is like systematic marginalization, forced language extinction, anything in like the government that is forcing these languages out. And so it was imperative to the decline of active speakers and written material, and the language is going extinct. So the problem became, how can you teach this complicated language to a large group of people before it's lost when you only have a few speakers left? And the approach they took was they funded a literacy program for tribal members and the greater community, so that more than just tribal members could learn this and the language could pick up. And they created a language resource website so that it was more accessible and had free accessibility. They used this using tribal members like the chief, who understood the language and had knowledge of the language still, and was able to write down meanings and definitions so they could teach people. The outcome was the immersive use of the website, and it was accessible on platforms for members to acquire reading, writing, and speaking skills in the Kainai dialect. And then because of this, young Kainatais Ina have begun to learn, read, and write the dialect. So this is a really, again, direct view of how anthropological approaches can revitalize languages, and more of a linguistic approach in that sort of field. The last one I have is a bit complicated. It's the otherworldly anthropology. This one it's about the privatization of space and privacy in space. So it's addressing space in space, as the author puts it. This one has a lot of issues in the paper that they address. I'll be addressing one, like the main issue he goes over, but the paper in total, if you want to check it out, has a lot of great stuff in it. It's mostly less so of a direct outcome fix and more of like a theoretical, like how people view things fix. So like a framework type of work. So the problem is that NASA is looking to address the issue of crew privacy and long-term space missions outside of Earth orbit. So these are like month-long missions where you're in close quarters with people, and it's specifically centered around habitat for the spacecraft design and use. So the approach was an ethnographic research by the anthropologist, where he participated in a human exploration research analog crew with 3 other crewmates and did a 3-day-long like stay with them to see what it was like living how they live in close quarters with them. And then conducted interviews, did archival research on previous missions, and guided walkthroughs of high fidelity space habitats built on Earth. So this is a very hands-on approach, very traditional ethnographic anthropological approach. And the outcome was a gained insight to the concept of privacy. For example, the use of the word ability when describing ideas around privacy is what a lot of the crewmates were using. Ability is usually in conjunction with like task orientated. It's the ability to fulfill a certain task or achieve a goal. So regarding privacy, this is the ability for the crewmates to work and live and achieve tasks while still maintaining an adequate level of privacy for themselves. So as he writes, privacy is a social importance as well as a group need. The group often groups themselves together when talking privacy. There's like group privacy, there's personal privacy, things like that. And it overall just contributed to how NASA will view privacy needs in space shuttles and other space environments going forward. So this is more affecting future research rather than past research, and just how NASA in total will build like shuttles and how they will treat their crews. And those are the 3 I did.
That stuff that I said, Jay is going to talk a bit about sort of some of the things that came up in looking at all of these together, and also some of the challenges we've had.
All right. First of all, thanks to our presenters. You guys did a great job and kind of set me up really well for my piece of the presentation here. So a lot of these themes and challenges that I'm going to talk about came up in a class discussion that was held after we had conducted the majority of our research, and I personally found them a very fulfilling discussion to have after that step of our research, and it kind of set us up to like get the broader scale of what we're getting out of this research. So some themes we discussed were access and accessibility. So this is how anthropologists are building bridges through the work that they're doing in other industries and organizations. So a great example of this is the Dug Well project. How are we helping people gain access to clean water? Another way, language revitalization. How can we ensure the best access to these resources for communities that are going to be needing them moving forward? Agency is a huge theme we come across not just in our research, but in anthropology as a whole. So this is how to provide people the ability to do and receive what they need. I think Sam did a great job of kind of discussing this in the case of the Vancouver Chocolate Project. How can we provide people the ability to get what they need out of a certain situation? So can we provide them with the tools to be successful rather than just giving it to them, right? Next, we have communication. This is a really multifaceted theme that we came across. It can be as simple or as direct as language use. So in the case of the Alaskan Language Revitalization Project, like the importance of communication, the value of communication and being able to communicate in traditional ways, but also themes as broad as how can we communicate our findings to the widest audience possible? How can we ensure that we are sharing the value of our work here? Holism is another very broad anthropological theme, but we saw it come up a lot in our research in terms of stepping back and trying to see the problem in a more multifaceted way. So how can, not just focusing on one aspect of a problem and making sure that we are kind of embracing the entirety of a culture or a problem to make sure that the solution is as successful as possible. Ethical engagement. So this is kind of in line with communication, I find as well, but just thinking of collaboration with communities and organizations, as it is a key component of a lot of the work that anthropologists are doing, and it has a significant influence on the success of any project or outcome that we're finding in these pieces of research. So in terms of the Denver Museum, like, of course, we can interact with Indigenous communities and everything, but how are we doing it in the most ethical way possible? And so that seems to be a key theme in a lot of the research as well. Traditional knowledge. This came up not just in the cases we reviewed today in this presentation, but in a lot of the other ones as well. This can be in the context of the integration of traditional knowledge into solutions, but also recognizing the value of traditional knowledge in and of itself. So the value of something like language revitalization having its own merit just in embracing that level of knowledge. Health. So these examples we had in our presentation today, such as the Ebola outbreak or the inclusion of Navajo beliefs into modern medicine, they're far from the only health-centered ones that we looked at broadly, but anthropology is a people-focused discipline at the end of the day, and so is health. They both are working on individuals and people. So they're kind of a match made in heaven in terms of helping each other out. So a lot of our projects focused on how to do medicine in a way that fits the people that we're trying to help the best. And of course, organizations, there was a lot of organizations coming to anthropologists and seeking help. So in this case, there are a lot of direct outcomes as we discussed, but this is, I find, where we get a lot of speculative outcomes as well. And in the case of NASA, as Sorcia shared. So yeah. As well, we did discuss in the same discussion challenges. This is not just challenges that anthropologists face, but even in the scale of just doing our level of research, like what are barriers to furthering our research, and just good things to keep in mind in terms of doing better research. So relevance, this is something I find me and Andrew found a lot in ours, is how can we ensure that we are communicating in the best way possible so that people really truly see the value of the research that we are doing. Without outreach, many people might not understand what anthropology has to offer to them or their problems, so they will not understand the relevance of an anthropological perspective. Scale is an issue in a lot of cases. So is the problems that we're trying to tackle, are they too large for the type of impact anthropology can have? This is going to be a problem in some cases, but that's where things like mitigation come into play. Like, maybe we cannot solve the problem, but how can we try to have the best outcome with this level of challenge? Feasibility is somewhat related. So are the changes that need to be made in order to remedy the problem, are they at a level or a realistic scale that we might be able to actually make a change with the type of research that anthropologists are well equipped to do. Again, this is not always the case, this is not always possible, but mitigation again can be a great solution in this in the face of this type of challenge. Similarly, complexity, it might just be that there are too many factors in a particular problem. Anthropologists might, you know, walk into a particular research scenario and find that there are just too many factors to a certain problem, that one solution might not be the best fit. You might need multiple solutions, multiple angles to tackle a single problem on. Bias is a huge challenge in a lot of cases, not just as anthropologists, within different organizations as well. This is often where we end up coming to issues of communication, and like in terms of the example of the navigation on the ships, like certain people's understandings of certain people's understandings of the way that other people communicate might become a barrier into how they disseminate information to other people. And it also, anthropologists have our own bias as well. We might miss something in a problem or a solution because of how we have been trained to think, or how we have been introduced to the problem itself. So just recognizing where we're all coming from and trying to step back and understand that there might be other perspectives that are important in this situation. Finally, speed. Anthropology is not the quickest process. Ethnography is not the quickest process. So in certain situations, like if there's an outbreak, in the case of Ebola, where there is a time component to the problem, there's a concern with how long we're taking to find information. We need to be really cognizant of that and make sure that we are doing the quickest research possible. And as I keep saying, mitigation is often a result of this. How do we mitigate issues rather than solve them entirely? So yeah, that's what we discovered.
Fantastic.